The first thing I noticed was my blue sweater lying in the dirt. It was the one I wore on Sundays, the one with the soft elbows my late husband used to tease me about. It was crumpled near the front steps, half covered in dust, like it had been dropped there without a second thought. For a moment, I honestly believed I had the wrong house. I stood at the end of the driveway, grocery bag cutting into my fingers, staring at the porch where my coat, my shoes, and a box of old photographs had been tossed like garbage. The wind lifted one of my scarves and carried it toward the rose bushes. I remember thinking very calmly, very strangely, that I should probably go pick it up before it tore. That was the day my daughter-in-law threw my clothes outside, and that was the day she forgot whose name was on the deed. Before all of that, my life was quiet in the way that only comes after you've lost too much to want noise anymore. I was 62 years old and widowed for almost 5 years. My husband, Arthur, had died of a heart attack on a Tuesday morning while tying his shoes. One moment he was complaining about his socks being too tight, the next he was gone. No warnings, no long goodbyes, just silence where a man used to be. After the funeral, I learned how loud an empty house can feel. The refrigerator hummed too much, the floors creaked at night. I stopped cooking real meals because cooking for one felt like admitting something permanent. The house itself was old but sturdy. Arthur and I had bought it when our son Daniel was still in middle school. I worked as a bookkeeper back then, careful and quiet, while Arthur did construction jobs wherever he could find them. We paid every mortgage bill on time. When Arthur passed, the house was already fully paid off, clean, simple, mine. Daniel used to say it was the family home, and I suppose in my heart I let it be. Daniel is my only child. He's a good man, kind in a soft-spoken way, conflict avoidant to a fault. He married Lydia 3 years ago. She was younger than him by nearly a decade, sharp-eyed, confident, the type of woman who spoke quickly and walked faster. When Daniel brought her home the first time, she complimented my curtains and corrected my pronunciation in the same breath. I told myself she was just different. When they married, they rented a small apartment across town. A year later, Lydia became pregnant, and suddenly everything felt urgent. They needed space, they needed help, they needed stability. "I was thinking," Daniel said one afternoon over tea, stirring sugar he didn't use, "maybe we could all live together for a while, just until we get back on our feet." He didn't look at me when he said it. Lydia smiled too quickly. "It'll be good for you too," she added. "You won't be alone." I remember the faint smell of lemon cleaner in the kitchen, the way the clock ticked louder than usual. I thought about Arthur. I thought about how lonely dinners had become. I told myself that family was supposed to bend toward each other in moments like this, so I said yes. At first it worked, or at least it felt like it did. I moved my things into the smaller bedroom at the back of the house. Lydia took over the master bedroom, the kitchen, the living room. She rearranged furniture without asking, donated dishes she said we didn't need anymore. I noticed, but I didn't comment. I told myself it was temporary. The baby arrived, a beautiful little girl with Daniel's eyes. I fell in love instantly. I sang her the same songs I used to sing Daniel. I rocked her at night when Lydia was too tired or too irritated or too busy scrolling on her phone. Slowly, without anyone saying it out loud, the house stopped feeling like mine. Lydia began referring to it as our place, then my house. She'd correct me if I called it otherwise. Small things began to change. I'd come home from errands to find my mail stacked unopened on the counter, my shoes moved from the doorway. She started locking the door during the day, even when she knew I'd be out. Daniel stopped meeting my eyes when Lydia snapped at me over nothing. Once I overheard her whispering in the kitchen late at night. "She doesn't need the whole house. She's old. She doesn't even use half of it." Daniel's voice was softer, harder to hear. "It's her home, Lydia." There was a pause. Then her laugh, light, dismissive. For now. I should have spoken up then, I know that now, but I was raised to keep peace, to not rock boats that were already unsteady. I told myself she was stressed. New motherhood changes people, I said. Give her time. Time, however, did not soften her. It sharpened her. She began asking questions too casually to feel harmless. Do you have a will? Do you know it'd be easier if everything was in Daniel's name someday? I answered vaguely, changed the subject. I didn't think she'd dare to push further. I was wrong. The morning it happened, I had gone out to buy groceries. Lydia barely acknowledged me when I left. Daniel was already at work. I remember feeling relieved to have a few quiet hours away. When I returned, my driveway was cluttered with boxes. At first, I thought it was a delivery mistake. Then I saw my sweater. I stood there, heart pounding slowly, methodically, like it hadn't caught up to the reality yet. The front door was closed, locked. I rang the bell once, no answer. I rang again, harder. Finally, Lydia opened the door just enough to step outside, blocking the entrance with her body. She crossed her arms. "You can't live here anymore," she said flatly. I stared at her, the words not quite forming meaning yet. "What?" I asked. She gestured behind me. "Your things are outside. I packed what I could. Daniel agreed it was best." My mouth felt dry. "Daniel agreed?" She nodded, lips tight. "We need space. This isn't working. You're disruptive." I looked past her into the house where my husband had died, where my son had grown up, where I had folded laundry and whispered prayers and built a life. "I'll call Daniel," I said quietly. She shrugged. "Do whatever you need to do." And then she closed the door. I stood there with my groceries melting in my hands, my clothes scattered on the lawn, and a realization settling deep in my chest. She thought she had won. She thought I was powerless. She had no idea what was coming next. I didn't cry right away. That surprised me later when I thought back on it. I always imagined that if something like that ever happened to me, I'd collapse right there on the lawn, neighbors peeking through curtains, tears soaking into the dirt. But in that moment, my body chose stillness instead. I sat down on the edge of the porch steps, right beside the box labeled winter clothes, and listened to the faint hum of the refrigerator through the door. The house sounded alive, comfortable, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. My phone trembled slightly in my hand as I called Daniel. He didn't answer. I left a message, calm, measured, careful not to sound accusatory. I asked him to call me back as soon as he could. I told him I was outside. I waited 15 minutes, then 30. The sun climbed higher. My ice cream softened into soup. A neighbor across the street glanced over once, then looked away quickly. I was grateful for that small mercy. Finally, I began gathering my things. I folded my clothes back into the boxes Lydia had packed, sloppily, without care. Some of my things were missing. My jewelry box, Arthur's old watch, a framed photograph from our wedding day. I noticed, but I didn't say anything out loud. Not yet. I loaded what I could into my car, each movement slow and deliberate, as though rushing might break something inside me that was barely holding together. I drove to my sister Margaret's house. Margaret lives 20 minutes away in a neat little place that always smells faintly of lavender and old books. When she opened the door and saw me standing there with boxes piled behind me, she didn't ask questions right away. She just pulled me into her arms. We sat at her kitchen table while I told her everything. My voice shook once or twice, but I stayed mostly composed. Margaret listened without interrupting, her jaw tightening with every sentence. "She locked you out," Margaret said finally. "Yes." "And threw your things outside?" "Yes." Margaret leaned back in her chair and folded her arms. "Does she know whose house that is?" I shook my head. I don't think she cares. Margaret smiled then, but not a happy smile, a knowing one. Oh, she'll care, she said softly. She just doesn't yet. That night, Daniel finally called. His voice was strained, tired. "Mom," he said, "can we talk?" "We are talking," I replied. There was a long pause. I could hear traffic in the background, the hollow sound of a man speaking from somewhere he didn't want to be. "Lydia says you were unhappy, that things were tense." "Tense enough to lock me out of my own home?" I asked. He sighed. "She felt like you were undermining her as a mother." "I raised you," I said quietly. "I never once told her how to raise her child." I know that, but she's stressed, Mom, and the baby." "And I was disposable," I finished. Silence stretched between us. "I didn't agree to throw you out," Daniel said finally. "She said you were planning to leave anyway." That was the moment something inside me shifted. Not shattered, not broke, settled. "I see. Then I'll give you both some space." "Mom, I'll call you later," I said, and ended the call. That night, lying on Margaret's guest bed, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling fan turning slowly above me, I made a decision I should have made months ago. I stopped pretending this was temporary. The next morning, I drove back to the house, my house, while Lydia and Daniel were both out. I still had a spare key, though part of me suspected she'd already planned to change the locks. I walked through each room quietly, touching familiar surfaces like I was saying goodbye to a living thing. I checked drawers, closets, cabinets. That's when I noticed how much had already been claimed. The master bedroom closet was filled entirely with Lydia's clothes. My old coats were gone. The guest room, once mine, had been converted into a storage space. My name was nowhere. I opened the filing cabinet in the study where Arthur and I had always kept important documents. The deed was still there. My name, clear and unmistakable, printed in ink that hadn't faded with time. I sat down at the desk and exhaled slowly. Lydia hadn't just crossed a boundary. She had miscalculated. Over the next few days, I said very little. I didn't argue. I didn't confront. I stayed with Margaret and went about my routine: work, errands, quiet dinners. On the surface, it probably looked like I had accepted my place. But inside, I was taking inventory. I called my lawyer, a woman named Elaine who had helped Arthur and I years earlier. She listened carefully as I explained the situation. "You cannot legally remove her," Elaine said, "not without eviction proceedings, and even then it's unlikely." "I don't want to go back," I said. "Not like that." Elaine paused. "What do you want?" I thought about the way Lydia had closed the door in my face, the way she'd spoken my son's name like a weapon. "I want respect," I said, "and I want my home back." Elaine nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "Then we'll do this properly." The following Sunday, Daniel came to Margaret's house alone. He looked smaller somehow, his shoulders hunched like he'd been carrying something heavy for too long. "I didn't know she'd do that," he said as soon as he sat down. "I believe you, but believing doesn't fix damage." He rubbed his hands together. "She says the house should be ours for the baby." "And what do you say?" I asked. He hesitated, just for a moment. "That we're family," he said. "That we should share." I smiled sadly. Family doesn't throw family out. He didn't argue with that. What Daniel didn't know, what Lydia couldn't have imagined, was that silence had never meant surrender for me. It meant preparation, and soon everyone would understand the difference. The first official letter arrived on a Tuesday morning. Margaret brought it in from the mailbox and placed it gently beside my tea as though it might explode if handled too roughly. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, with my name typed neatly across the front. I recognized Elaine's firm letterhead immediately. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I watched the steam rise from my cup and listened to the soft ticking of Margaret's kitchen clock. There was something grounding about delaying the inevitable, about choosing when the next chapter would begin rather than letting it rush me. When I finally tore the envelope open, I felt a surprising calm settle over me. The letter was addressed to Daniel and Lydia. It stated clearly and professionally that I was the sole legal owner of the property at 114 Willow Drive. It outlined that my removal from the home had been unlawful. It requested immediate access to my residence and the return of any personal property removed without consent. It wasn't angry. It was firm. I folded the letter carefully and slid it back into the envelope. "Are you sure about this?" Margaret asked. "Yes," I said. "I should have done it sooner." That afternoon, Daniel called. His voice was tight. "Mom, Lydia got a letter." "I know," I said. "She's furious." "I imagine she is." He sighed. "She says you're trying to humiliate her." "I'm trying to live in my own home," I replied. There was a pause, then softer. "She didn't know the house was only in your name." "I know," I said again. That was the problem. By evening, Lydia had sent me a message. It was long, accusatory, full of words like selfish, manipulative, punishing a young family. She ended it with, "I thought you loved your granddaughter more than this." That one hurt. I stared at the message for a long time before setting the phone face down on the table. Then I did something I hadn't done in months. I prayed. Not for revenge, not for vindication, for clarity. The next day, Elaine called to tell me Lydia had responded through a lawyer of her own. The tone, Elaine said, was aggressive, defensive. Lydia was claiming verbal agreements, shared residency rights, emotional dependency. "She's grasping, but she's also scared." I nodded, though again she couldn't see me. I should be. Within a week, the situation became public, not the legal details, those remained private, but the emotional fallout. Daniel's in-laws began calling him. Questions were asked at church. Lydia's mother showed up at the house unannounced, demanding explanations. Lydia always cared deeply about appearances, about being seen as the capable wife, the devoted mother, the woman who had it all under control. And now cracks were forming. Elaine advised me to return to the house, but not alone. We arrived together one morning, Elaine carrying a slim briefcase, me holding a small overnight bag. Lydia was there, arms crossed, eyes blazing. "You have some nerve," she said the moment I stepped inside. "This is my home. I'm returning." "You're tearing this family apart." "No, I'm refusing to disappear." Daniel stood in the hallway, pale and silent. Elaine handed Lydia a copy of the court filing. "You have 30 days to vacate, or we can proceed formally." The room went quiet. "You can't do this," Lydia whispered, her voice breaking just enough to sound convincing. "Where are we supposed to go?" I looked at her then, not with anger, but with something closer to sadness. "You should have thought about that before you threw my clothes outside." Daniel finally spoke. "Mom, maybe we can talk about a compromise." I shook my head. I already did, and I was ignored. That night, for the first time since Arthur died, I slept in my own bed again. I cried, not loudly, not desperately, but steadily, as though my body was releasing something it had been holding for years. The sheets smelled faintly of lavender detergent Lydia favored. I changed them the next morning. Over the next few weeks, Lydia's behavior shifted. The sharpness softened into politeness, then into forced friendliness. She offered to cook dinner, asked if I needed anything from the store, apologized without quite saying the word sorry. "I just didn't realize how hard things had been for you," she said one evening, setting a plate in front of me. "I told you, you just didn't listen." Daniel began spending more time away from home, longer hours at work, quiet dinners. I could feel the tension settling between them like thick dust. Eventually, Lydia moved out with the baby to her mother's house, temporarily. Daniel stayed. One night, sitting across from me at the kitchen table, he said, "I should have protected you." I reached across and took his hand. "You still can," I said, "by learning." He nodded, tears gathering but not falling. Lydia filed for mediation instead of court. She wanted to negotiate, shared ownership, compensation, some version of control. Elaine declined on my behalf. Your house, your terms. By the end of the month, Lydia was gone. The house felt quieter, but not empty. It felt restored. After Lydia left, the house didn't immediately feel peaceful. It felt hollow, like a room after the music stops and you're left with the echo of what once filled it. I moved through the days carefully, as if any sudden motion might stir the tension back to life. Daniel stayed in the guest room for a while, speaking little, moving as though he were afraid of disturbing something fragile. I gave him space. That, too, was a kind of lesson. Lydia, however, was not finished. The first public crack came at church. I had returned after weeks of absence, choosing a pew near the back. The familiar hymns washed over me, grounding and steady. I bowed my head during prayer, focusing on the worn wood beneath my hands. After service, whispers followed me like a shadow. Not cruel ones, curious ones. "I heard she kicked her own daughter-in-law out. They say the baby was involved. Isn't that Daniel's mother?" I smiled politely. I said very little. Lydia stood near the entrance, holding my granddaughter, eyes scanning the room until they landed on me. For a moment, I saw something like panic cross her face. Then she straightened her shoulders and walked toward me. "I just want everyone to know," she said loudly, her voice trembling just enough to draw attention, "that I never wanted things to end like this." The conversations around us quieted. I tried to make it work, but some people don't believe in compromise. I looked at the baby in her arms, my heart tightening. "I believe in responsibility," I said calmly, "and in kindness." A few people shifted uncomfortably. Lydia's cheeks flushed. "She's trying to take everything from us," Lydia said, her voice cracking. "She's choosing property over family." That was when Margaret, who had come to church with me that day, stepped forward. "No," she said firmly, "she's choosing dignity." The silence that followed felt heavy, but not cruel. Lydia left shortly after. By the next week, word had spread, not because I spoke, but because truth has a way of surfacing when lies are forced too loudly into the light. Daniel's friends began asking him questions. Lydia's mother stopped returning calls. The narrative Lydia had tried to build didn't hold under gentle scrutiny. Daniel, for his part, began to change. One evening, as we ate soup at the kitchen table, he said quietly, "I didn't see it before, how much she controlled the space, the story." I stirred my bowl slowly. "Love shouldn't require erasing someone else." He nodded. "I'm starting to understand that." The real turning point came when Lydia demanded access to the house, unannounced. She showed up one afternoon while Daniel was at work, pounding on the door, her voice sharp through the wood. "I need to get some things," she called. "You can't keep me out." I opened the door, but didn't step aside. I can gather anything that belongs to you, I said evenly, and I'll leave it on the porch. She scoffed. You can't just lock me out. I can, I replied, legally. She stared at me for a long moment, then laughed, short, bitter. You think you've won. I think I've stopped losing, I said. She left in a storm of words and slamming doors. 2 days later, Daniel came home early. She's filing for separation, he said quietly. I set down the dish I was drying. I'm sorry. He shook his head. Don't be. I think it was already over. I just didn't want to admit it. That night, Daniel slept for nearly 12 hours straight. The following weeks were filled with paperwork and quiet conversations. Lydia asked for mediation again, this time about custody and finances. Daniel agreed. I stayed out of it as much as possible, offering support but not interference. That was another lesson I had learned too late, but not too late to use. The house slowly became mine again. I repainted the guest room, brought my things back into the open, hung Arthur's photo in the hallway where I could see it every morning. One afternoon, while folding laundry, I found the blue sweater Lydia had thrown into the dirt. Margaret had washed it carefully, mended a small tear I hadn't noticed. I held it for a long time before placing it gently back in the drawer. Daniel began therapy. He talked about boundaries, about guilt, about learning to say no without apologizing. I watched you do it, he said once, and I realized how little I'd ever done that. I smiled softly. We teach by example, even when we don't mean to. Months passed. Lydia's anger cooled into distance. Communication became formal, limited to emails about their daughter. She no longer came to church. She stopped calling the house hers. One evening, Daniel sat across from me on the porch, the air thick with summer heat. "Do you think she ever meant to hurt you?" he asked. I thought for a long moment. "No," I said finally. "I think she just didn't think I mattered." Daniel swallowed hard. That was my failure, too. I reached over and squeezed his hand. "You're still learning," I said. "That's all any of us can do." As the sun dipped below the trees, I felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Not victory, peace. Peace, I learned, is not loud. It doesn't arrive with apologies wrapped in bows or dramatic moments where everyone suddenly understands what they did wrong. Peace comes quietly, slipping in when you're busy doing ordinary things, watering plants, sorting mail, standing at the sink with your hands in warm water. That was how it came to me. One morning, I realized I'd gone an entire week without bracing myself before opening the front door. Daniel was still living in the house, but differently now. He asked before using shared spaces. He replaced things he borrowed. He listened more than he spoke. Sometimes I caught him standing in the hallway, looking at the old family photos like he was seeing them for the first time. The house was teaching him, too. The first real test came when Lydia asked to bring my granddaughter over. "She says it's important for the baby to know where her father grew up," Daniel explained carefully, watching my face. I set my mug down and considered it. My chest tightened, not with anger, but with memory. "She can come," I said, "but Lydia needs to ask me directly." Daniel nodded. "That's fair." The message arrived that evening. It was shorter than any message Lydia had ever sent me before. "I'd like to bring Emma by on Saturday, if that's okay with you." No accusations, no guilt, just a request. "Saturday is fine," I replied. "I'll be home." When Saturday came, I baked muffins the way I always did, blueberry with a little sugar sprinkled on top. The smell filled the kitchen, warm and familiar. I set the table carefully, using the good napkins I'd saved for company. Lydia arrived right on time. She looked different, tired, thinner. The sharpness that used to sit in her posture had softened into something closer to caution. She held Emma tightly, as though afraid I might disappear if she loosened her grip. "Thank you for letting us come," she said quietly. "You're welcome," I replied. We sat at the table together. Emma babbled happily, smearing muffin crumbs across her cheeks. I wiped them gently, and Lydia didn't stop me. At one point, Lydia cleared her throat. "I shouldn't have done what I did. I was scared, and I thought if I acted confident enough, it would become true." I waited, didn't rush her. "I thought if the house felt like mine, everything else would fall into place. But I didn't earn it. I just took it." I nodded slowly. "And taking always costs more than asking." She swallowed. "I know that now." It wasn't an apology in the traditional sense, but it was honest. And honesty, I've learned, is sometimes the beginning of forgiveness. After they left, I sat alone in the living room, listening to the quiet. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt settled. The public consequences followed naturally after that. People stopped whispering at church. Some approached me directly, offering gentle words of support. Others simply smiled with new understanding. The story had found its shape, and it no longer painted me as the villain Lydia once needed me to be. One afternoon, a woman from church, someone I'd barely knew, took my hand and said, "I hope I'm as brave as you are someday." I thought about that later. I hadn't felt brave. I had felt tired. And sometimes tired women do the bravest things because they can no longer afford to be quiet. Daniel eventually moved into his own apartment nearby. The day he packed his things, we worked side by side in comfortable silence. When he hugged me goodbye, he held on longer than usual. "Thank you," he said softly, "for not giving up on me." I never did. I just stopped carrying what wasn't mine. The house settled again after he left. I rearranged furniture, planted new flowers along the front walk. I hosted small dinners, laughed more, slept better. I even began volunteering at the library twice a week, reading to children who listened with wide eyes and unfiltered trust. Sometimes, late in the evening, I'd sit on the porch and think about how close I came to disappearing from my own life. Not because I was weak, but because I was taught to make room at my own expense. Arthur used to say, "A house only stands if the foundation is respected." He was right, and so was I, finally, for respecting myself. The last thing to return was my sense of ownership. Not of the house, but of my voice. It came back slowly in small, unremarkable moments. The first time I corrected a cashier who shorted me my change. The first time I told a friend I didn't feel like hosting and meant it. The first time I said no without explaining myself afterward. For years, I had mistaken politeness for goodness. I had believed that keeping quiet made me kind. What I was learning now was that silence, when forced, can be its own kind of surrender. One afternoon in early autumn, I found myself sorting through old paperwork in the study. Sunlight spilled across the desk, warming the wood where Arthur used to rest his elbows while paying bills. I opened a drawer I hadn't touched in a long time and found a stack of yellowed envelopes tied with string. Old letters, utility receipts, notes Arthur had written to remind himself of small things. Fix the hinge, call Margaret, buy roses. At the bottom was a folded piece of paper in his handwriting. "If anything happens to me, make sure you never feel like a guest in your own life." I sat back in the chair and laughed softly through tears. Even gone, he had a way of speaking directly to what I needed most. That same week, Lydia called. Not texted, called. Her voice sounded hesitant, like she wasn't sure I'd answer. "I wanted to ask," she said after a pause, "if you'd consider watching Emma one afternoon a week, just until I get back on my feet." I closed my eyes and thought carefully before responding. "Yes," I said, "on Wednesdays." She exhaled audibly. "Thank you." "Lydia," I added gently, "this works because we're clear now about boundaries." "I understand," she said, and for the first time I believed her. Wednesdays became something I looked forward to. Emma toddled through the house like she'd always belonged there, touching walls, peeking into corners, discovering the echoes of a place built long before her. I told her stories about her grandfather, showed her the apple tree in the backyard, let her nap in the same room where Daniel once slept with his favorite blanket pulled to his chin. The house held her easily. One afternoon, while Emma napped, Lydia lingered at the door. "I used to think strength meant control," she said quietly. "I see now that it doesn't." I nodded. "Strength is knowing where you end and someone else begins." She smiled faintly. "I wish I'd known that sooner." "So do I said, "but knowing it now still matters." Not everything healed neatly. Some days were heavier than others. Some memories still carried a sting, but I was no longer afraid of them. Pain, I'd learned, loses much of its power when you stop letting it decide who you are. The final legal matter concluded in late winter. Elaine called to confirm everything was settled, clean, clear, final. "You stood your ground," she said. "Not many people do." "I stood on it. There's a difference." Spring came gently that year. I painted the front door a soft green, planted new roses where Lydia's boxes had once been stacked. On the anniversary of Arthur's passing, I set a chair beside the garden and talked to him out loud, unembarrassed by the birds or the breeze. I kept the house, I told him, but more importantly, I kept myself. That night, as I locked the door before bed, I noticed something simple and profound. I wasn't checking it out of fear. I was locking it because it was mine. By the time summer returned, the house no longer felt like something I was defending. It felt like something I was living in again. Mornings became slower. I woke with the windows open, the sound of birds replacing the old habit of bracing myself for footsteps that weren't mine. I brewed coffee and drank it at the kitchen table instead of standing at the counter. I stopped apologizing to empty rooms for taking up space. These were small things, but they added up. Daniel visited on Sundays now, not out of obligation, out of choice. He'd bring bread from the bakery near his apartment, still warm in the bag, and we'd eat it with butter while talking about ordinary things: work, traffic, a movie he'd seen, a book I was reading. Sometimes he talked about Lydia. Not with anger, not with longing, with clarity. "I didn't realize how much I disappeared," he said once, staring into his coffee. "I thought being agreeable made me a good husband." I nodded. "It makes peace easier in the moment," I said, "but it makes truth harder to reach." He smiled faintly. "You always did know how to say things like that." I smiled back. "I just didn't always say them out loud." On one of those Sundays, Daniel asked a question I knew had been sitting in him for a while. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked carefully. "Standing your ground the way you did?" I considered it, honestly. "No," I said. "I regret waiting so long to do it." He exhaled, like something had finally loosened. "I'm glad you did, even if it hurt. It didn't hurt because I stood up for myself. It hurt because it revealed what was already broken." He nodded slowly. That was the difference I wanted him to understand. Lydia and I settled into something that resembled mutual respect. We were never friends, but we were no longer enemies. She arrived on Wednesdays on time. She asked before making requests. She thanked me and meant it. Once, as she watched Emma toddle toward the old apple tree, she said quietly, "I used to think you were trying to control us." I didn't respond right away. I wasn't trying to control anything. I was trying not to disappear. She swallowed. "I see that now." That was enough. I didn't need remorse. I needed recognition. As the months passed, I began telling parts of my story, carefully, selectively, not as gossip, as truth. Women at the library listened with a kind of quiet intensity I recognized immediately, the kind that comes from seeing yourself reflected somewhere unexpected. One woman, recently divorced, told me, "I thought I had to leave everything behind to start over." I shook my head gently. Sometimes starting over means staying and standing. That realization changed more than just my living situation. It changed how I moved through the world. I stopped shrinking to make others comfortable. I stopped explaining my choices to people who weren't affected by them. I learned that dignity isn't loud, but it is unyielding. The house bore witness to all of it. I refinished the dining table instead of replacing it, kept the old creak in the third stair because it reminded me where I was. I didn't erase the past, I integrated it. On the anniversary of the day my clothes were thrown outside, I stood on the porch alone. The roses were in full bloom now, heavy with color and scent. I remembered how small I had felt standing there with grocery bags melting in my hands. And then I looked at the door behind me, open, unlocked, waiting. I stepped inside and closed it gently, not in fear, but in peace. That night, as I prepared for bed, I caught my reflection in the mirror. Older, yes, but steadier. I thought about how easily my story could have ended differently, how quietly I might have accepted being erased, how often women are taught that endurance is the same thing as virtue. It isn't. Sometimes endurance is knowing when to stop enduring, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is say, "This is mine, and I am staying." I still wake up some mornings and glance at the blue sweater folded neatly in the drawer, the one Lydia threw outside that day. I touch it lightly, remembering how small and invisible I felt standing in the driveway, the wind lifting the scarf across the lawn. But now, when I hold it, I feel something entirely different: resilience, ownership, the quiet strength that comes from refusing to disappear. The house has become more than bricks and walls. It has become a testament to lessons learned, boundaries honored, and dignity reclaimed. Every creaking stair, every familiar corner, every photograph hung just so, all of it tells a story of a life lived with intention and of a woman who refused to be erased. I look back at that day when my daughter-in-law threw my clothes outside, and I realize it wasn't just an act of cruelty, it was a revelation, a moment that forced me to see clearly who I was and what I was willing to protect. Not just a house, not just memories, myself. I hope anyone listening to this story understands something important. Boundaries are not selfish, speaking up is not cruel, and insisting on your own dignity is not unkind, it is necessary. Would you have stayed in that house? Would you have fought for your home or walked away quietly? I want you to think about that. Think about what it means to hold your ground, to claim your space, and to never let someone else decide your worth. Life will test you in small ways and in large. It will challenge your patience, your kindness, and your sense of what is fair. But the moments that seem like the hardest are often the ones that shape you the most. And sometimes the people who try to erase you are not the ones you need to defeat. They are the ones who remind you who you truly are. Thank you for listening to my story. If it touched you, please share it with someone who might need to hear it too. And if you want to hear more stories of resilience, family drama, and lessons learned the hard way, please consider subscribing. Because these stories aren't just mine, they belong to all of us who've ever had to stand up and say, I am here, I belong, and I will not be forgotten.